Today I'm going to be taking the VRO 2 unit off of this and replacing it with a fuel pump. I'm also going to be replacing all of the fuel hoses. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with that. So here's a close-up of the engine. Here's the old fuel line. Comes in from the intake right below here. Goes through a fuel filter. Then it goes on to the VRO pump over here. Couple of things we'll want to do. Of course, we're going to take all this stuff off. I've moved some of this wiring out of the way so we can get a little bit easier access to it. The fuel pump is going to go right here. So you'll see that there's two screws, and I'll show you what the fuel pump looks like. Here's the fuel pump. It's going to sit hose down and somewhat right in there. There'll be an intake line. The new line, the yellow line I showed you previously, will go through a new filter that I just bought and into the fuel pump. The fuel pump will go out towards the T, and we're going to recover this T. This will be the only thing that we use right here. So this T is going to be used to do two things. The line's going to feed it from the fuel pump, and then from here the center line is going to go to the primer, and these two will feed the carbs. I don't have the carbs installed right now, but the theory is the same. This is actually coming from the primer, and it is going, it should be going to the primer port on the carb. Since carb's not installed, that's not there. Disconnect some of these fuel lines and we'll get everything installed. And get this middle screw. This middle screw is basically a port into the manifold. You notice it has a gasket on it, if you can see that. And pressure from the manifold is what's going to drive the new fuel pump that goes on there. I'm going to clean that up a bit first before I mount the fuel pump. The new fuel pump comes with a gasket. It does not come with the appropriate length screws, so I ended up ordering these. These are stainless, and I'll be using these to mount them. I looked up the original part and got the length, so what the thread was, and ordered the appropriate stainless screws for this. So before I start mounting the new hose and everything, I am going to clean this up a little bit. The fuel pump comes with a gasket, but I'd feel better if it's clean. It's really the center hole that we got to worry about, because that's where the pressure comes to drive the fuel pump. They call it an impulse port. And the next thing I'm going to do is cut away some of these old hoses just to make room for the new. And the one thing we're going to keep out of this is going to be this T, because this is going to be a distribution unit that goes to the primer as well as to the carburetors. I'm going to cut those loose right now. And again, I'm replacing all these hoses, so I don't feel too bad about mangling them a bit. I just don't want to break the T. And I broke the T. So I'll be ordering a new T, or I'll be making a manifold of my own. There we go. There is the nasty old VRO 2 unit, and we'll set that aside. I'll probably play around with it, do a rebuild on it just because. So here's the new fuel pump, and I've got the gasket that goes for it. What I'm going to do is insert these screws that I bought for it, place the gasket over it, and get this installed. That's a snug fit. Let me get these started. So here's the new fuel pump, and got the gasket set on there. The two new stainless steel screws that I purchased, because the old ones wouldn't work, they were too short. See if we can get a shot behind the fuel pump. You can see the gasket attaching it to the port on the manifold, so that we should get pressure to drive fuel through it. So one of the advantages of making your own manifold is that you can direct the hose nipples in whatever direction you want. In this case, I kind of angled two of them towards the carburetor. That's where they're going to go. The red one from the primer is going to go in the middle, and the one from the fuel pump is going to go on the bottom. Before I do that, I'm going to attach these two primer hoses. These are the hoses that come from the primer and feed gasoline into the basically right into the throat of the carburetor and right into the manifold. Now this one hose that's left over, we're going to have to either plug this or remove it. If we remove it, there's a nipple that goes into the crankcase, and because this is the impulse hose, so if we leave this open, there's going to be a leak from the crankcase. So I'll go ahead and get all the other hoses hooked up, and then we'll deal with this hose later. I'll probably remove it at some point. For now, I'm just going to plug it and move it out of the way. Alright, now that I've got the primer hoses connected to the carbs and the carbs installed, I'm going to go ahead and install this new manifold. We're going to start with this just to measure it. This is going to the primer. What I want to make sure is I got enough room for that, and these two will feed the carburetors. I've got a bolt, stainless steel bolt, and I'm going to use that to plug up this impulse line. And I've got a hose clamp. It's probably a little big for this, but it'll do. Just have to turn the screw 1,000 times. And we want to make sure this is sealed off, because if we don't, when the lower piston number 2, is on the backstroke, that actually charges the loop system on these engines. And if there's a leak, which this is what this would be, you're not going to get that cylinder charge for the compression and firing cycle. Alright, that's on there tight enough. That's not going anywhere. I will eventually remove that hose. At whatever point I have to service the starter, because I'll have to take the starter off to get to the nipple that's attached to the engine block. As you can see, I've already put this replacement fuel pump on, and now we're just going to put some hose and filters in there. Instead of the normal filter, which would look like this, which is what usually comes with these, I actually elected to go with an Edelbrock filter. Has a replaceable cartridge inside of it. It's rated for 300 horsepower engine, so should work fine. If it doesn't, we'll replace it later with a standard OMC filter. Now, one of the nice things about these filters is they're unidirectional. They can go in either direction. The way they work, it's got a sintered brass element on the inside, and these can be replaced or cleaned out as needed. They do a pretty good job of getting the fuel nice and clean. So this line with the bolt in it, that's an impulse line that's attached to the block. I'd like to take it off, but I really don't want to at this point. I'd have to take the starter off so I can get there, get in there and plug up that hole. What I've done here is replace the manifold with a brass one. If you remember, when I was removing the VRO tube pump, this particular unit broke. So looking at replacements, if you can find these, are around 35, 40 bucks. They don't make them anymore because they break. So the replacement part from OMC, BRP and OMC, is $80, and it's brass. What I went ahead and did was ordered the brass parts off trusty Amazon, and kind of built one of my own manifolds, which should work fine. I'll attach it later once I get everything back together. All the fuel line has been replaced, so I've got this red PVC. It's actually racing fuel line for motorcycles, dirt bikes, and snowmobiles. With this red one, I've got one going to the primer pump, this one down here, and coming back from the primer, I've got these blue primer hoses. So all that's been replaced. It's got a new manifold. And now all I have to do is attach the fuel line to it. And we'll just get a measurement here. Alright, it's all attached. What I'll end up doing is, once I get the intake muffler, if you will, on this, I'll attach this with a small piece of rubber and some tie straps so it'll stand nice and neat. We'll keep it out of the way of the starter motor, and may have to reposition it a little bit, but I think we'll get this working right. Of course, one of the first things I'll do after I put fuel in the system and prime it is check for leaks, make sure that everything's nice and tight, and that's it. We've replaced the VRO 2 unit, that's gone. Have a fuel pump that we've put in, new fuel filter, and new fuel lines.